Awesome to be with you guys. I guess today I wanted to start off by asking a question. Does anyone ever have trouble when you're not in the driver's seat? So you're not in control. Does anyone have trouble with that? Yeah, I'm the worst backseat driver, right? I can drive better than anyone taking me for a ride, and it's so hard to bite my tongue. And then, I don't know if you're like me, maybe you've grabbed the poop handle, as me and my friends call it, and they catch you holding on to that, and are you feeling all right? Yeah, I feel fine. I don't know what you're talking about. But not only do we have this issue with driving, I reckon we have this issue, if we look at this with our life. If we're not in control, if we're not in the driver's seat of our life, we tend to struggle. Right? If I'm not in full control of what I'm doing with my life, it's really hard. Now, I remember for me, a time this was really true was when I first came to Australia, got married, had to be here a month and a day for some reason, and then got married to my lovely wife, and then I had this really horrible thing happen. I had no control. After I got married, I applied for something called a bridging visa. So, if anyone here knows what a bridging visa is, it's kind of like what you do in the interim while you're waiting to see if you can stay. When I applied for this bridging visa, since I had a little kid, I applied for special permission to work. But you don't know what's going to happen. So you send off this application, and then it just takes months, and you'll get a letter back. And it was really hard in those months, because I had no control. I was 19, I just got married, and I had a newborn. I had no way to work. I had no way to control when I'd be able to work. And I was just sitting there playing a waiting game. And one of the worst parts were, before I applied for this bridging visa, just to show you guys how good I am at math, I did the maths wrong on how much my visa would cost. I was just a little bit short. Just about $2,000. But it's okay. That's why it's good to have parents. And I called my mom and just expressed to her how I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do, Mom. And then the next day I called her and she was in the bank getting a loan for me in the States. So that just shows how amazing my family is. But I wasn't the greatest at math. And I had so many things happening that I didn't have control over. And it's really hard when we're in situations like that. And I reckon letting God have the final word is hard as well. Because if we're going to let God have the final word, that means I have to let go, right? That means I can't be in the driver's seat, which is hard. I can't be the one in full control. And that's a really challenging place to be. And I think one of the reasons this is such a challenging place to be is something called ego. Have you guys ever heard of this word, ego? No? You guys are all saints. You're way better than me. It must be an American thing. We all know about ego.
That's true.
Oh, you know what? I'm just going to go now. Someone else can do the message. You can just click through the sides. See if you can figure out where I was going. Nah. But we all have an ego, right? Everyone does. And the ego is what makes it really hard to let someone else have control. Because I know better. If I was in charge, just let me fix things. I'll bag out America again. If anyone knows, there's a U.S. election coming up, which is priceless to me, because every politician gets on the news, and they could run the country better if they were in charge, right? You always hear that. Oh, if Republicans were in charge, things would be better. If Trump was doing this, oh, if Biden did this, and they just go at each other. Doesn't matter who the nominees are, it's just what they do, right? And I think that's because of ego. But we do the same thing. How often do we talk to our friends about stuff here and we're like, oh, if I was in charge, I'd run Australia so much better. I got all the solutions. Just call me up. Come on. I've got all this experience. So we all have this thing called ego. And your ego, if you don't know, is the part of you that relates to I, me, and mine. It is the part that defines you as separate from others. So it's kind of what gives me my individuality. It's not a bad thing. We need an ego. So I want to make that clear. It's your sense of your worth. Right? So we need an ego because we need to have a good sense of worth. We need to realize that we're worth something. If we have no ego at all, we'll be a doormat and let people walk over us, which isn't a good thing. But with egos, if we have too much ego and we become something called egotistical, has anyone ever met someone who's a bit egotistical? Nico, put your hand down. I'm the best MMA coach, so you know. It's just knowledge. No, joking. But no, we've all met people who are a bit egotistical. And when we're egotistical, it's kind of like my word is final. I know better. Listen to me and just fall in line. And it's tough when we realize that. And we all have moments where it's not a bad thing to notice that we're a bit egotistical in some areas. So you shouldn't think if you notice that you're ever egotistical, beat yourself up about it, because it happens. I'm a parent. I love my 3 kids. They're beautiful. They never stop. They ask me endless questions that frustrates me sometimes, and I have to tell them when I'm driving, Dad needs to focus so I don't hit a car. Which they don't listen to most of the time, but that's all right. God keeps me safe. But with my teenage son, I've noticed something. When he's little, I can tell him what to do, right? Caleb, do this because that's what I said. You know, he's 8 or 9, he's got to do the chores. Now he's a teenager. He's 14. I noticed recently that I wasn't letting him speak and share his voice or his opinion. I was shooting it down. I was a bit egotistical. I would say things like, Caleb, I've lived longer than you. I just know better. Just listen to me, okay? How egotistical of a statement is that to make? So I started noticing that and having to pull back my own ego in some areas. And we all have met people who don't do this. People who say their word is final. They're usually the worst people to have as friends. They're the worst people to work with because there's no compromise, right? It's my way or the highway. Get in line or my bus is going to run you over. And what's funny to me is this has been our problem since the garden. So since the Garden of Eden, we've had this problem with our ego. We've had this problem with wanting to sit in the position of power. Just like how we say with politicians, if I was in charge, the country would be better. We've had that since day one. Since day one, we had that with God. If I was in charge, man, I could do stuff better. And we see this in the garden. I want to read this story in Genesis to you now. That's how it starts off. Now the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Love the question, right? Serpent's crafty. Did God really say? Is that really what God said? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit from the trees in the garden, but about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, you must not eat it or touch it or you will die. So she shares what God said. Which, I mean, if we want to be honest for the woman here, God didn't say don't eat it. Like, no, I command you not to. He says, hey, don't do it or else you're going to die. It's kind of like, has anyone in here had little kids? And you're trying to teach them that stoves and fires are hot? And they go to touch the stove, and you're like, don't touch it, it's hot. What does the kid do 9 times out of 10?
Touch it.
Touch it, and then they go, ow. And you're like, I told you. I kind of feel like God was doing that. Don't mess with that, because it's going to be bad. Trust me. This is what the serpent says. No, you will certainly not die, the serpent said to the woman. In fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Ooh. Like it's the woman leaning in, I like to imagine. Right? She hears that, being like God, knowing good and evil, being the one in charge. Ooh. Pretty nice. I like to boss people around. The story goes on. The woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, and that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. So she took from its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. I want to pause here. I've heard 1,000 sermons where we look at the garden story and we want to give the woman a lot of grief, I just want to say to all the blokes in the room, you were there. Okay? You did nothing too. So it's not all the women's fault. Bloke was there. In the story, we see that he was right there just hanging out, hearing this conversation go, and decides to join in. And then, let's read what happens. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Man. Something that sticks out to me in this story. And I encourage you to read the rest of it, what happens after, because you'll see what I'm talking about. But two words that really stick out to me are like God and that their eyes were open. So that's what the serpent kind of says, right? If you eat this fruit, you'll be like God. You'll be the person in charge. You'll have all the knowledge. Your eyes will be open. You'll see things clearly. It's funny to me, too, those two things. Because I think those were two things as a kid when I was growing up and I got to teenage years. I wanted to be like God. I wanted to make the rules. I knew how the world worked at 16 years old. Like, come on. Why can't old people get it? My eyes were open and theirs weren't. Like, come on. So I can see this. This gets them pulled in. But what this starts is a blame cycle. And you'll see it go on in Genesis. Because once the ego gets big, once we want to be like God, once our eyes are open and we think we have all the knowledge, we think we know how the world works and people need to listen to us, we tend to not take any blame when stuff goes wrong. And it starts this cycle of blame. We see it in politicians all the time. What happens when something doesn't go through? They blame the other one, right? I mean, the yes-no campaign thing, not getting into that, what you voted, it's all good, but one thing that makes me really laugh about that whole situation, right? Did either side at the end take ownership for anything they could have done better? Or was it just more blame? We're going to point the finger. We see it in the garden too, so it's something that's been there since day one. If you read the rest of Genesis, you don't have God come up to Adam and say, why did you eat the fruit? And Adam go, yeah, you're right, God. Shouldn't have did that. My bad. No, what does he do? It was this woman. If you didn't give me this woman. And then what happens? The woman, he goes to the woman. Oh, why'd you do that? She doesn't go, yeah, you're right. My bad. I should have listened. No, she goes, it was this snake. Why'd you do this snake? Like, come on, this is on you, man. This isn't on me. Right? Starts the blame cycle. And we see this pattern. And this blame cycle starts because we all have an ego. And we want to feel like we're the ones who are in charge. We're the ones in control. We're the ones who have all the answers. So it's hard to take ownership when we mess up. So we blame. And we start this cycle. And when we're in this cycle, and we're in this blame cycle, there's kind of no growth in our life. Have you ever met people in the world who've had stuff happen to them? And yeah, they're hard things. We all go through hard things, and I'm not minimizing that at all. But have you ever met people who just stay in that blame cycle? If only someone would have gave me a handout, if only this person would have been different in my life, if only this person. And what's funny to me with those people is oftentimes there's no growth. They stay there. They stay in this cycle of pain and anguish, and they're in this blame cycle that just never ends, and there's no growth. And I think if we want this growth, if we want this new growth to come into our lives, if we want to grow into who God's really made us to be, we have to break the blame cycle. Which is a really hard thing to do, because to break the blame cycle means we need an egoic death. I think I said that wrong. Egoic? There we go. I got it right the second time. Look at that. Practice makes better. But we need an egoic death. We need a death of our ego. Not where we have no ego at all, but maybe where we're not as much as prideful. We're willing to take ownership. We're willing to not be in control. We're willing not to be in that driver's seat dictating where things go. I mean, to me, this is one of the many victories Jesus shows at the cross. The God of the universe. What does he do on the cross? Does he get himself off the cross? No. Does he zap everyone with lightning like Thor? No. He dies. He hangs there and dies for you. If that's not an egoic death, I don't know what else is. But that's what we see Jesus do. He shows us how we can have victory over our ego. And this is something he even taught about. And I want to look at a story found in Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 34. And this is what we read. One of the scribes approached when he had heard them debating and saw that Jesus answered them well. He asked him, which command is the most important of all? Now, I kind of like how this story is set up, because it seems to me, we get the feeling that Jesus he's on a roll. Have you ever been on a roll? Like, just where, like, I don't know, it's like everything's going perfect, you're answering stuff right, like your brain switched on. Whew, those are good days. I feel like this is one of those days for Jesus, right? He's on a roll. Even the scribe kind of sees it. He's like, man, this guy's good. I'm going to ask him a question. I'll get a good answer. So he leans in and asks him this question. Jesus answered, the most important is, listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other command greater than these. Now I love how the scribe asked one question, right? What's the greatest commandment? He didn't want the plural form. He wanted one. And what does Jesus do? He gives them this answer. These two things that go together. You know, loving God and loving our neighbor go hand in hand. We can't love God if we can't love our neighbor right here. Let's read how the scribe responds. Then the scribe said to him, you are right, teacher. You have correctly said that he is one and there is no one else except him. And to love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is far more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. You see, all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. That means nothing to us, right? Has anyone here ever done a burnt offering or sacrifice? No? Yeah, I haven't really either, so don't worry. But like in their culture, this is their way, right? This is the way you get close to God. These are the commands that God left you. And this scribe says, yo, Jesus, you answered it right. All these are worthless if we don't do this. That's a big statement. How much of his ego did he have to let go of to answer a question like that? Like, do you know what scribes do in that time? They knew the law. Like, not just like knew it where they're like me, you know. I feel like, you know, we'll get a theology degree. I can go Google some stuff and, you know, pull up some notes. No, these guys knew it so well, they didn't even need to go to the scripture to remember the law. It was memorized in their head. Imagine that. This was his life. He says it's all worthless if you don't love God and love others. It's a big statement. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And no one dared to question him any longer. I love that story. I love that story for a number of reasons, but I love the main point Jesus gets to at the end, where he looks at this scribe, you know, kind of claps for his answer. And then goes, you're not far off the kingdom of heaven. You're not far off of being back in that Garden of Eden, where we dwell with God, where we hear God's whisper so easily. And one of the reasons I believe this scribe was not far off the kingdom of heaven is because He was letting go of the tree of knowledge. Because ultimately, that's our downfall. The tree of knowledge boosts the ego more and more. Makes us think we are the ones who know better. You know, if we could just take the knowledge we have and give it to someone else, life would be so different. And this is something, as a society, we've done for centuries. The Roman Empire, why did they spread so rapidly? Because they thought they had it the best way. They had the government set up the best way. If they could just conquer and rule everyone else, it would be peace. And we can look back at that and say, those Romans, they're awful. But we're no different. I mean, I'm from America, so I can, poke holes at my own country back home, which I still love. But how often do we try to fix problems by going in there? You know, we'll go to these third world countries or countries that have been ravaged, and we'll try to fix them by putting our ways on them. Because we have the knowledge. I see this scribe letting go of the tree of knowledge. And that's one of the first things we got to do if we want God to have the final word. Because when we're letting go of that tree of knowledge, it's allowing God to have the final word. It's allowing us not to be the ones with all the answers. And this doesn't mean that we stop trying to learn, we stop trying to grow. I'm not saying that. You know, I still love to read books. I'll read any theology book. I'll read any book out there, history, whatever. I'll keep trying to learn and grow. But I let go of the ultimate goal of having this tree of knowledge and knowing everything, because I'm never going to know everything. Matt's only one person. Yes, God's made me awesome. God's done some cool stuff in me. He makes me do silly stuff like get Donatello tattoos on my wrist for my birthday, you know, like, God's great. But I don't have all the answers, and that's okay. I'm going to keep learning. I'm going to keep growing, but I'm going to be all right with a bit of the mystery. I'm going to lay my ego down enough that when I mess up, I'll own it. I'll say I could have done stuff better. And that's a hard thing to do. It's easy to say up here, but it's hard when you're in leadership team meetings here at the church and you have messed up and you have to own it. It's hard when you send too cranky of an email and then you go back and you have to reply to that email and go, all right, I was a little bit abrupt, I apologize. But if we do that, if we let God have the final word, we'll see Him moving more and more as our ego gets out of the way. And we let Him have the driver's seat, because oftentimes He has a better plan than us. You know, I still remember when I had was waiting for my bridging visa, how good God was. I did so many jobs under the table to get me some money. I don't think that can get me in trouble now. Hopefully not. We'll find out. If I get arrested after this sermon goes online, you guys know what happened. So, thank you guys for your time. No. But I remember how many jobs I did under the table. Like, I had a friend who now has this big business throughout Toowoomba. And when he was first starting off, he said, Matt, come help me build stuff. I said, look, I have no idea how to build. He thought I was joking until I showed up and I didn't even know how to use a power drill. That was really funny. When he was like, really? You've never used one? I was like, I wasn't lying. Like, I don't know how to do this stuff. But he let me work with him. And he paid me under the table, which was awesome. Because then I had some money to buy stuff for my family. Then I got a job where I used to have to clean semi-trailers, trucks, whatever you guys call them, big trucks with a hose, and we get a forklift, and you raise up on the forklift that's got a pallet on it, probably not the safest thing. But I did that as well. Got some money under the table. Met a guy who had a paper company who let me work there, and I thought I was just working, kind of showing him how great I was, so maybe I'd get a job one day. But he ended up blessing me and my wife with a car when we first got married. So God came through again and again. The bridging visa came, I was allowed to work, and yeah, it was a struggle at first, and I didn't really find any jobs, but eventually I got a job at Pizza Hut. Which for me, for 4 or 5 years, that meant I could get food for my family, and that was a win. So when we get out of the way and we let God have the driver's seat, we'll be surprised with what he does. But if that ego's in the way, it might stop us. It might stop some of those things. I could have easily gone when, my friend asked me to build and, I used to think building didn't take much brains. Sorry, guys, that was just Matt. I thought, if you were smart, you had to know books. That's the way I was raised. Really full logic. I understand that. But if I would have let my ego jump in, I would have never took my friend up on his offer. Or no, I'm too good to, clean semi-trucks. Like, don't you know I went to uni for a year? Studied nursing? Like, come on, my dad's a lawyer. I could have missed out on those opportunities. When I looked endlessly for jobs and everyone was saying no, and then Pizza Hut says, look, we'll give you a job, I could have been like, you know what? I'm 19. I got a kid. I'm too good for Pizza Hut. See you guys later. No, I had to let go of my ego. We have to let go of the tree of knowledge and allow God to have the final word. Allow God to be in the driver's seat so God can move like he wants to do. Which oftentimes is going to surprise us. And it's going to stretch us. Are we willing for that? Because the minute the stretching starts, you know what we'll all want to do? We'll want to grab back onto that tree of knowledge. And are we willing to let it go and move with God? Let him be the one in control. Because I think if we live that way, we'll be surprised with what God does in our life.